Many of you may know me, some of you may know me from when I lived here and worked for ACT Health. Some of you probably remember me harassing you to take students in my various roles as a clinical educator and clinical coordinator for the University of Sydney and later Charles Sturt University. Just a little bit of extra background about myself. I have been a clinical educator for almost 40 years. And my first student arrived on the second week of my work as a new graduate on day one of week 2, long before the letter from the university arrived telling me that she was coming. And I've had students ever since then. I've had them typically in groups of 4 to 6. I've had up to 16 interprofessional students on placements in Vietnam, in service learning placements. I still continue to supervise students. I do a lot less of it now that I'm in a leadership and management role, but I still do and I love it. I do a lot of supporting of student learning on placements, and I do a lot of supporting of my staff who support the students on placements and deal with and support the clinical educators in the field. So I still feel very connected to the realities of clinical placements, and I think it's a privilege to have that connection and to have found such a satisfying career path, really, that's kept me connected with education in a very practical way. As you mentioned, I have worked across allied health disciplines, very much so now, but also when I was at Charles Sturt University. In my current role, we have 9 allied health disciplines in the Faculty of Health Sciences. We also have a Bachelor of Health Sciences, which prepares students for graduate entry into the clinical disciplines, but also into a range of other work settings. And the placements that those students undertake are not clinical placements, they're more work placements. And so understanding how those processes work and the literature around work integrated learning placements that aren't health has really enriched my understanding of what we can do with placements and how we could go about supporting student learning. And my 3 years as Deputy Head of the UQ Medical School taught me a lot about the very different contexts in which placements occur and the preparation and support of clinical supervisors for placement management. Today I'm going to hopefully talk for about 40 minutes and then stop for questions. I've got to take my watch off. I have taken my watch off. There it is. And so I might ask Anne if you'd just give me a 5-minute wave when I'm 35 minutes in. I'm going to introduce you to work integrated learning as a bigger umbrella concept above placements. Talk about work integrated learning as a continuum of educational opportunity from the classroom to the practice setting. A little bit about preparation for practice. I want to introduce some concepts and frameworks that we can draw on as we step through this presentation. I'm going to touch on work readiness. I'm then going to look at a little bit of the evidence base for work integrated learning, and as you'll see, the lack of evidence base. A little bit about what constitutes an ideal learning environment and quality in work integrated learning placements. And then I want to leave you with 2 overarching frameworks that I think if we embrace those, we would do a lot to improve quality and efficiency of placement management. And then questions. So I've deliberately taken a very broad definition of work integrated learning from the Australian Chamber of Commerce and the Innovative Research Universities. It doesn't have a date. WIL is a term used to describe a range of approaches that integrate theory with the practice of work within a purposefully designed curriculum. The most common form of WIL involves student placement or project within a workplace. We're more familiar with the placement side of it. University students and employers work together to design and create a learning experience that benefits all parties. And I think the benefiting all parties is something I want to return to later, because I'm not sure that it is always mutually beneficial. And there are ways in which we can ensure that it is more beneficial for all parties. The students' progress and learning outcomes are monitored and assessed by the university with input from the employer, and that in this case is the supervisors. So we talk about work as learning and real-world learning. Placements in the work setting are a very special type of learning. but they are only one point on the continuum of work integrated learning. So if we look at what can occur in the classroom and think about PBL, problem-based learning or case-based learning, and then think about focused learning activities within lectures. Not everybody runs a PBL or a case-based learning curriculum. It's expensive to do that. But we can do very focused learning activities within classrooms that are related to the practice setting. There are practicals of all sorts that develop the skills that students need to go on placement, tutorials, simulations, virtual patients or clinics, standardised patients actors, and high-tech simulation. I will talk a little bit about the evidence for that because it's increasingly common and people have a lot of hopes riding on simulation, which may or may not be well-founded. Students need to develop generic knowledge and skills for placements, and they can do that in a range of non-clinical placement environments like service learning or role emerging placements and interprofessional educational experiences. And I'm going to talk about the first two of those a bit later. And then we come to the traditional clinical placements that we recognise and I think many of us are engaged in, and the increasing use of student-led clinics. What makes clinical placements or work integrated learning, work-based learning so complex and tricky is all the variables at play. There's the model of placement that's used, and there's still a fair bit of clinging on to the apprenticeship model in some disciplines, despite evidence that the collaborative model is a lot more effective for sites and for student learning. The approach to student learning varies from the watch and do as I do approach through to the placement educator being the facilitator of student learning. And then, of course, students have a great capacity to self-direct their own learning with great responsibility if they're allowed to and if they're well set up to do so. The use of peer learning, whether or not we use it or if we do use it, are students actually well set up to make the most of it? It doesn't come automatically. I think students need a particular set of thinking and skills around peer learning to make the most of it. Then we've got unidisciplinary placements or interprofessional placements. Interprofessional placements are becoming more common and they're very vexed, of course, because of disciplinary boundaries, issues around interprofessional supervision, fear from some supervisors that the students will lose critical time in their unidisciplinary environment and may not achieve the competencies required for registration and accreditation. The jury's out on that. We simply don't know whether putting students into interprofessional placements jeopardises their unidisciplinary placements. Opinion and anecdote says it doesn't, but we don't have hardcore evidence of any substance yet. Questions about who leads the placement. Is it student-led or is it clinical educator-led? The whole range of variables that fit under placement quality, and I'll talk a bit about those later. Issues around level and frequency and amount and type of supervision that's provided. The agent of supervision. Is it the unidisciplinary supervisor or someone from another discipline? Is it the nominated clinical educator and or other people in the department? So I might be the nominated clinical educator for a batch of 4 or 6 students, but you're going to bet I'm asking for help from my colleagues in my department to provide input and support to the students and also to me. We can use input and supervision from non-health professionals depending on the sites that the students are placed in, teachers, carers, disability workers and so on. Interprofessional supervision, of course, student self-supervision and peer supervision, all are part of the valuable mix of supervision input that students can receive. And then we've got issues of supervision quality, the knowledge, skills and attributes of the clinical supervisors and how those might be developed. The ubiquitous question of time, because of the dual roles that clinical educators have, patient care and student learning, and the whole plethora of other administrative and professional tasks that they have to complete at the same time. Time is always very pressured. And when I did my doctoral research, I did use Phenomenological Methodology. It was a qualitative study of clinical educators' experiences of being a clinical educator, and one of the constant themes was time. And one of my research participants described her day-to-day working life as feeling that she always was looking at a clock on the wall and the clock always had an angry face. So, preparation for work-based learning for students requires generic and discipline-specific knowledge, skills, and of course, personal attributes that run across both. It's the generic knowledge and skills that I think we struggle with most. Until recently, when the federal government demanded we be accountable within universities for the development of graduate attributes, which are founded on generic knowledge and skills, and then there are also the discipline knowledge and skills, we didn't really know how students developed these generic knowledge and skills. We assumed that they did by osmosis or by feedback from their supervisors or their lecturers, but we weren't really sure. Now we deliberatively build in learning opportunities and assessment items into the curriculum that require students to focus on generic knowledge and skills and demonstrate it. And increasingly, those things are part of accreditation requirements as well. A lot of the generic knowledge and skills lend themselves beautifully to interprofessional education curriculum and development and delivery. And one of the things that's happening in my faculty at the moment that I'm leading is in fact a generic interprofessional preparation for practice curriculum that will begin to tackle these things. The attributes are interesting. Students definitely come with orientations and a set of personal attributes when they start their study as a health professional. Some of those can be shaped to a certain extent through awareness and feedback and punishment. But when you have repeat offenders who don't demonstrate ethical awareness and a strong moral positioning and professionalism, or an incapacity to be self-directed and self-managing, it's tricky. And I am of the view that those are the students that we need to direct attention to help them exit from our professions early. And I rely on you as placement supervisors to help me identify those students, because it's often in placements that we become first aware that we have students who are not able to develop the attribute set that we need. I just want to touch a little bit on knowledge types. The work of Angie Titchen and Joy Higgs has informed my thinking quite a bit about this. So propositional knowledge we're all very familiar with. That's textbook knowledge, theory. It's what we teach students at university about how to assess and manage, deliver interventions and treatments. Then they get to the practice setting and suddenly a whole new set of knowledge is required because they see people doing things differently. Sometimes what's different is that it's not evidence-based practice that they're seeing, but sometimes it's professional craft knowledge. Often it's professional craft knowledge, which is the very automated, streamlined knowledge about how you actually get things done. It's the efficiency and automated routines of professional practice. And then there's the personal knowledge, and an excellent place for developing that is placement, because students have to be responsible for the welfare of other people. And for some of them, that might be the first time they've actively had to be responsible for the welfare of somebody else, their clients or their patients. So knowing yourself is a major focus of clinical placements. We attempt to address it in the classroom as well, but placement is an ideal opportunity and probably the only opportunity for the development of professional craft knowledge. So, what's the role of work-based learning in the development of these knowledges? I'm really, I'll touch a little bit later on the work of Stephen Billett, but I'm increasingly of the view that Placements offer the opportunity for students to put into practice what they already know, and sometimes they're confused about what they know. And I'm sure you've all had that situation where you ask a student, what do you know about X? And they go, tremble, tremble, nothing, nothing. Oh, we haven't done that at university. Now, of course, often that's not true. They have done it, but it's been presented either long enough ago that they haven't remembered it or refreshed their memory of it, or it was presented in a way that doesn't look like what it needs to look like in this context. Knowledge has to be applied within context, and that's where placement is so important. Out of placement activity comes a whole new set of knowledge and theory, which ideally students would take back into the classroom and unpack it and look at it and see how it relates to what they've already been taught at the university. That's the missing link, I think, in work integrated learning. I don't think universities do a good enough job of taking the new knowledge that was acquired through practice and looking at it again in the lens of what was already known and what the literature tells us is good evidence-based practice. You can help students commence that process by asking them constantly what they're learning and how it relates to what they knew. But it's really a job that we need to do a lot better. Okay, so knowledge, skills and attributes are integrated into a very skilled performance. And high-tech, authentic environments, not necessarily high-tech, authentic learning environments, the best of which, or the most frequent of which, is placements, but they're not the only authentic learning environments, is the site for that integration. Then we've got the question about what are these integrated into? Is it competence or capability? And I'm actually not going to even begin to engage in that discussion because I know how contentious it is. But I will declare my hand and say I'm a great believer in holistic integrated competencies, and I have to be because a lot of my research work has been in the development of an assessment tool that sits on a foundation of integrated competencies for speech pathologists. But work readiness comes in here too, and this is something very much of concern to employers. So New South Wales Health never misses an opportunity to tell me in meetings that the graduates aren't work ready. Now that used to puzzle me because we have very robust assessment tools, at least in speech, pathology, OT and physiotherapy, around the assessment of entry-level standards and competencies. And students aren't allowed out the door until they demonstrate all of those. So why is it they're not work ready? I've come to understand that what employers are referring to around work readiness gaps is the high-level communication skills of things like handovers, really sophisticated interpersonal skills that I think develop with maturity, teamwork skills, which develop with experience of teamwork, and management and leadership skills. Now, teamwork skill development is tricky because if we persist in uni-disciplinary placements where students are only placed within their context, they're not going to have the full range of teamwork skills that they need the minute they hit the floor when they graduate. So we've really got to do something about that. The Garling report, of course, noted that some of these work readiness skills are lacking even in experienced staff. So it's not just new graduates that are lacking them. But we do need to do more to address these. So, I'm just going to take you back to the previous slide. I stole that graphic from a website of one of the business schools at one of the universities in Melbourne. And I love it because I'd want to know how it relates to work readiness. He's got a calculator in one hand and he looks like he's juggling jelly beans. I think it's the juggling, the capacity to juggle and have technical skills. So whose responsibility is it to make sure that our graduates are work ready? Well, I think it's a shared responsibility, or I wouldn't be standing up here today. How, when and where is work readiness best developed? We actually don't know. We don't have a good evidence base for that. The other question that's not here, but I think is really underpinning to all of this, is what's realistic for new graduates to achieve? And what has to be developed in the work site in that first year. And I know that some work sites, employers like ACT Health, have put incredible effort and energy into the new graduate experience and supporting them to develop the work readiness that's required for a very complex work environment. So with those background remarks, I'm going to talk a little bit about the evidence base for work integrated learning. I was thinking about a metaphor for the evidence base. And the first one that came to mind was actually Swiss cheese. Because a good Swiss cheese has got lots of holes in it. There are bits of thickness, but there are other bits that are paper thin. And in work integrated learning, some of the research is quite strong in some areas, but in others it's paper thin. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the thick areas and some of the paper thin areas, but not all of them. I can't. There's just too much to cover. And then I thought about it more as a patchwork quilt in progress. I think as research in work integrated learning is really taking prominence now, and that's the result of a decade or more of good support from the Carrick Institute and then the Australian Learning and Teaching Council, and that continues in the form of the Office of Learning and Teaching and now HWA. There is a framework for research in place, so the pattern for the patchwork quilt is in place, and different people in different locations with different disciplinary groups are working on putting the squares and into place and stitching them together. I'm going to talk about just a couple of the squares: simulation, service learning and role emerging placements, student-led clinics and models of placement, with an emphasis on how the model of placement influences productivity and levels, types and amount of supervision. I'm going to provide evidence across the whole hierarchy of evidence, from anecdotal evidence and opinion through to qualitative research and descriptive studies and some really good clinical studies and randomised controlled trials. The latter are severely lacking, I might say. So let's have a look first of all at simulation, and first of all at technology-enhanced simulation. And I'll just draw your attention to a systematic review by Cook and colleagues published in 2011, a very comprehensive systematic review and meta-analysis. They culled almost 11,000 papers down to 609 that met the inclusion criteria, some of which were randomised and non-randomised studies, with a total of more than 35,000 participants on which they did the meta-analysis of outcomes. The major health disciplinary groups were physicians and medical students, nurses and students, emergency technicians and students, dentists and students, vets and students, chiropractors and students, and then another mixed ambiguous category which regrettably contains allied health and not a lot of it. So the main focus was, which is very telling about where allied health work integrated learning research is at, mostly focusing on surgery, resus and trauma training, physical examination, communication and team skills, and various technology-assisted procedural skills. So not unsurprisingly, out of the meta-analysis comes a large heterogeneity, but in comparison to no intervention, so where the learners had no other form of learning intervention that would build the same skill set, simulation was shown to have a very large effect size for knowledge, skills and behaviours on the measures used, but interestingly only moderate effect sizes for patient-related outcomes. And this is always the issue with research in work integrated learning. We can measure outcomes for student learning, for supervisor satisfaction, supervisor perceptions and so on. It's a whole range of data we can collect, but the research generally is pretty silent on what difference does this make to patients. So in the absence, for example, of any data about whether supervision of students actually improves patient or client care, you could ask the question, is supervision needed? You could make a case that perhaps we should just save a lot of time and money, because in the absence of an evidence base, maybe we don't need it. There were no statistically significant interactions between simulation training and various features of instruction, like learning activities that go for greater than 1 day, mastery learning, so the learners keep doing the task until they show mastery. So while it wasn't statistically significant, larger effect sizes were observed. Now, this is a really interesting author group because I cite them again in the next paper, but they go to great lengths in this paper to say that only 4% of the studies reviewed, so 4% of the 609 studies, fail to show a benefit from simulation training, and therefore they believe that we can stop research now about whether simulation is useful and switch our research focus to when and how to use simulation most effectively and cost efficiently. And I think that's true. We know it works, so let's stop trying to prove that it works and instead start to manipulate all of the instructional design variables to find out which are critical, how much is critical, and when is it best used. The absence of allied health in these simulation research studies, I think needs addressing, and I've got some data later on that shows where it's being addressed. But I'm hesitant to accept Cook's conclusion for all of the health professions because the professions that have been focused on in these systematic review and meta-analyses are largely what are called the technique-oriented professions. There's a whole other group of health professionals, the person-oriented professions, and the simulation studies typically to date haven't included them. So I'm holding on allied health. Virtual patients and virtual clinics are becoming more common, and again I go to a lovely systematic review of Cook and his colleagues. They note that most cognitive errors in patient care arise from faulty interpretation, synthesis and integration, and judgment, rather than insufficient data. People have enough data, they're just not skilled enough in using it. And their knowledge base is generally pretty good. So it's interpretation, synthesis and judgment, and they argue that virtual patients provide an opportunity to improve cognition around patient care. A much smaller pool of studies, this time only 700, 54 met the inclusion criteria. And they showed that virtual patients are associated with large positive effects compared to no intervention, and that they're positive for learner satisfaction, knowledge, reasoning and a range of other skills. The effects in comparison to non-computer instruction are on average small. So they're asking the question about whether virtual patients are or are not as powerful as non-computerised instructional means. The comparisons of the different designs for virtual patient training suggest that repetition until mastery is achieved. The use of advanced organisers, which is where you front load information and you tell the learner that this is important and they're going to have to draw on it in the learning activity. Enhanced feedback and explicitly contrasting cases so that learners begin to build up a bank. These all contribute to better learning outcomes. And quite rightly, they advocate that further research is needed on virtual patients. Standardised patients have been used for a long time in medicine, and Boken, Rethens, Shepia and van der Vleuten, many of you will know the work of van der Vleuten. I've drawn on it a lot in assessment. Their systematic review concluded that students taught by standardised patients providing instruction and feedback demonstrated skills equal to those taught by traditional methods, including clinical placement. There's some really interesting work in progress at the moment. Impress, work's concluded, it's Impress, Anne Hill at the University of Queensland and her colleagues in speech pathology have looked at the replicability of standardised patients' performance, because unless you can ensure replicability, instruction is flawed, and certainly if you're using standardised patients for assessment, that's problematic. There's a nice study in train at the moment at the University of Sydney with my colleagues Julia Blackford and Jenny Allison. We're just about to do the second trial of this, but last year we trialled 2 interventions with physiotherapy students in a cardiopulmonary setting or a rehab setting. Group 1 had a week of simulated learning environment and then 4 weeks of normal placement. And the control group had their normal 5-week placement in either of those 2 settings. The students in the simulation group felt better prepared for placement and reported richer learning experiences and better teaching input and pace than students on the normal placements. I'm really interested in that because in the qualitative data, it's just so clear that it's the structure, pacing, and quality of teaching and feedback that they think has made the difference, not necessarily the standardised patients. So if we could take those instructional features into a normal clinical placement, I wonder whether we could improve the power of teaching and learning outcome. So at the end, there was no difference between these 2 groups in their ability to achieve competency on the assessment of physiotherapy performance tool, rated at mid and end of placement. Now that's really encouraging because there's, as you know, a big push to replace clinical placements with simulated learning experiences, and we need to know that simulation is at least as good as clinical placement. There is a wonderfully strong randomised controlled study in physiotherapy simulated learning environments coming out of the University of Queensland, Gwendolyn Joel's research team. So they ran 2 RCTs using 2 different models. One where students did a week of simulated learning and then went into 3 weeks of their normal placement. And then in the second RCT, there was simulated learning running in parallel for the traditional placement in the first 2 weeks. So students were pulled out of the normal placement and put in the simulation learning environment. And again, students' achievement of clinical competencies were no worse in the simulated learning groups than in traditional placement groups. And that's encouraging. And I've just put a little note there for you, for those of you that aren't familiar. The Assessment of Physiotherapy Performance Tool is one of the 3 national tools used in every program in physio, OT and speech in Australia. So for speech pathology it's COMPASS, and for OT it's the SPEF-R, and all 3 are highly reliable, validated instruments, and the fact that they're used nationally is very exciting because in speech pathology that's had this tool for a decade now, we've amassed through our online portal where all of the student assessments, or most of the student assessments, are now entered, a huge database which we're using now for research that is allowing us to look at whether placement type, length, sequence, etc. impacts on the trajectory of the development of competence. And I'm sure physio and OT are preparing, if not already embarked on, similar research. So the trick is highly validated and reliable tools, and to my knowledge, they don't exist in the other health professions yet. Okay, service learning. Again, I'm drawing from non-health service learning material for my first definition. This comes from Griffith. So service learning typically involves a student engaging in not-for-profit or philanthropic activities with a community partner to experience work-integrated learning and citizenship. And you can tell that that probably comes from a business school orientation. Of course, the not-for-profit experience that they get in health is in the health and disability and educational settings. Not so sure there's much philanthropy going into those settings. And then I turn to my best friend Wikipedia for a more comprehensive definition of service learning. I'll let you have a little read of that. So the keys here are community, service to a community, experiential learning, reflection, students taking responsibility, and developing citizenship, and strengthening a commitment to the common good. Now you may ask why I'm talking about service learning, and it's because I think that we're going to see a lot more service learning type placements, and I'm going to describe to you one that comes from our partner, the Broken Hill University Department of Rural Health. They provide hundreds of student placements a year, hundreds of student placements a year. Sometimes we have to drag the students kicking and screaming to Broken Hill, but I've never had one come back without loving it. And why do they love it? Because it's a really well-structured learning program that not only teaches them a whole set of generic and discipline-specific skills, knowledge and attributes, but they have fun. They're integrated into the Broken Hill community. It's a very, very deliberative structure to the learning program. And they run a number of service learning placements. And they're based on a range of theories, socio-cognitive theories, experiential learning, complex systems, because communities in which the service learning occurs are very complex systems, service learning orientations and community engaged scholarship. There's a range of research in progress. Some of it's already out in the literature, and you'll see David Lyle and Deb Jones' name in the literature, but there's a lot more in the pipeline. And they're focusing on stakeholder outcomes. So what's the benefit of these student placements to the communities and the sites, to the students, to the school children, the pupils and the aged care residents, to the clinical educators and to the educational program support staff. There's a lot of background program support staff involved. That's what makes it so successful. I'm going to come back to some features of that service learning placement at Broken Hill in a little bit. Who are the OTs in the room? Okay, so I think you'll be familiar with role emerging placements and the literature. These are best established in occupational therapy. I have developed and run some of these for speech pathology, and they are successful. So a role emerging placement's defined as a placement which occurs at a site where there's not an established occupational therapist role. There's typically no OT on site. Students are supervised on a daily basis by someone within that site. It could be the manager, it could be the disability care worker. If it's a community managed organisation, it could be a client group leader. There's a whole range of possibilities. They also get support from an off-site OT, often a clinician that's contracted in or works in an adjoining service, or they get it from an academic clinical coordinator. And they work in settings like homeless shelters, refugee camps, residential homes, etc. The placements are driven by a range of pragmatic and educational rationales. In OT, the rationale is that OT needs to expand the boundaries of practice to move away from illness models and institutional focused services to prevention models and health and social care environments that draw on health promotion, prevention, wellbeing and community practice. I think these have great potential for other disciplines as well. The data around role emerging placements is pretty non-existent. What there is typically descriptive or anecdotal, but it does show the value. The students value autonomy. They definitely expand their knowledge of their discipline. It increases their awareness, but also their skill for collaborative working, and it definitely improves their organisational communication and critical reflection skills. Some more robust research that I haven't yet seen in the literature, but I'm aware of the thesis out of the UK, are phenomenological studies, so qualitative research, one step up the evidence hierarchy, but positive outcomes from that data. So I think these are an underutilised set of placement opportunities. Right. Gosh, time goes quickly. All right. Oh, hang on. I think I just missed a slide in my excitement to speed up. Okay. Student-led clinics. There is some literature on student-led clinics. I think, again, the evidence base here is not strong, but it will become stronger as these are rolled out. I've just worked with South East Sydney LHD to develop a student-led clinic for Sutherland Hospital in chronic care, and we're doing our pilot in August, and I'm very excited. So watch the literature for that. Okay, models of student placement. Drawing from the Department of Human Services in Victoria, 2007 assertion, without evidence, clinical placements in hospitals and health services represent a significant cost to services. Well, in the absence of evidence, I'm wondering what was being costed. Was it supervisor time? Was it patient services? Were those direct or indirect patient services that were provided by the students? That assertion flies in the face of admittedly old data that shows that students are not a cost in terms of direct patient care, and I do acknowledge that the longer a placement goes on, the more benefit there is to an organisation that hosts students. There are several studies in physiotherapy that show real benefits to departments in terms of occasions and amount of direct client care. And then there's a raft of studies that show all the value-adding, the indirect patient care, the tangible rewards for clinical educators, and the increased self-esteem and work satisfaction that comes from contributing to the development of future professionals. Now, I'm not an Alice in Wonderland. I know how hard supervising students is. So while I might feel great satisfaction and increased self-esteem, I do have days when I go home and want to bash my head against the wall. I want to draw your attention to this study because I think at the moment it's the most powerful piece of evidence that we have. It comes from the Mayo Clinic in the US, where they've tracked over many years what happens to clinician productivity when they work with 3 to 4 students at a time for 9-week blocks, and they do this for much of the year. I think one of the things that makes placements unproductive and a drain on services is where you have just 1 or 2 students once or twice a year. Get into the role of it, they become a real boon to a department that's hosting them. The Mayo Clinic runs a very structured program, a good orientation, goal setting. Students get to observe in the first week. They get exposed to patient care in the second week. Throughout their placement, there's a real emphasis on peer learning and other learning activities like developing in services and running them for the staff. By week 4 or 5, students are expected to be at a 50% caseload, and at week 8 at a 75% caseload, and the final week is evaluation, wrapping up and handovers. Now, where students are on placement in multiple collaborative models like this one, the Mayo Clinic data shows that the clinical educator is at least twice as productive as a clinician in the same department with the same caseload but without students. Now, it is an American study, it is a different model. What have we got in terms of recent productivity studies in Australia? Not a lot, but I'm laying the foundation at the moment for a large-scale grant application. I've already got a number of partners in play with this, but just a little bit of low-level data. They're all from physio, that's where I've started my focus. So in a private hospital, having 4 students per block for multiple blocks a year adds 14% income to the physiotherapy department from patient care and equates to a third of a clinician. In a private practice, students add 20% to the bottom line, the dollar, for that clinic. And in a mid-sized public hospital physio department, they run their outpatient services entirely with student input. No students, no outpatient services, and the students contribute the equivalent of another full-time clinician. A little bit. Can I take 5 minutes for my question time? A little, because I want you to hear this. This is really interesting research in progress. And again, this is Broken Hill. I'm drawing on the allied health clinical educators, Claire Brunero and Judith Merritt. They run student placements in a range of settings. I'm focusing here on schools. The schools were desperate for speech pathology input and OT input in Broken Hill. The schools set the priorities, we deliver. It's mainly oral language and literacy development, and for the OTs it's a lot of pre-reading work and fine motor development. These are what we call low-risk, high-volume clients. You wouldn't want student-led clinics or student indirect supervision in high-risk patient settings like acute care and ICU for all the obvious reasons. The students get indirect supervision from their discipline supervisor. using a range of methodologies, face-to-face and technology. Students do outreach visits, so Skype's used a lot. Direct supervision is very small. They get 2 hours, each student gets 2 hours a week from their discipline supervisor, another hour a week from the other discipline supervisor. They get supervision and support from the site. It might be the teacher, the principal, the teacher aides as requested. They get an hour of peer supervision a week on a very structured process, a student from their own discipline and a student from the other discipline, and they get debriefing of 3 hours a week in a group setting. So you can see that there's not a lot of face-to-face supervision. Are people happy? Is it working well? Yes, they're ecstatic. Students are attaining at or above the level expected on the standardised, reliable, valid assessment tools. Student satisfaction is very high, even with the interprofessional supervision, which is interesting because there's a lot of literature that shows students don't like interprofessional supervision usually. And student satisfaction with the peer learning and peer supervision is very high. I think this comes back to really good preparation of the students and an excellent learning program. Good use of peer learning, good use of reflection. I'm going to run out of time. So I've got... Where's my watch gone? Yeah. I've got 10 minutes. I think I'll stop. I was asked to talk a little bit about quality, but I think I've sort of signalled a fair bit around quality in that. I will, however, draw your attention to the 2012 report by Siggins Miller for Health Workforce Australia. I couldn't have summarised it better than they've summarised it. So I just draw your attention to page 34. The facilitators, none of them are surprising. The barriers, occupational stress and workplace incivility and aggression, and then other issues. I think I will definitely stop there and it's question time.
Thank you very much, Lindy. We have got 2 cordless mics here. Heather over there, and I've got one here. Can I just ask myself, be the first in here, would it be possible to have a copy of the slides that I can send out by email to the participants today?
Yes,
right, thank you very much.
I drew on a huge amount of references and I haven't put the references in, so I can send you the slides as they are, but if you give me, let me come back from my holiday in Germany and I'll send you the references.
This might be a July thing, because I've been ready to. So we'll throw it open. I see a person, Heather, up you go. Anybody else running up and down these stairs? Just wait for the mic, please. Thank you.
With that last study in Broken Hill, you mentioned that it was great or quite successful for the students involved.
And for the pupils.
Oh, I was going to say,
yep.
The pupils as
so
well.
The measures that are used, I probably skipped over that, so I'm glad you're asking the question. So the measures that were used to, the pre-post measures for the pupils, language and literacy skills show very strong gains. And the satisfaction of the principals and the teachers is also very high.
Okay, thank you.
More questions? There's just here, Heather, at the front, 2nd row, 3rd, 4th row. Thank you.
Hi, Lynette Jackson from CIT. I'm also a clinical placement coordinator, so I know the struggles.
What's CIT?
Canberra Institute of Technology. With these wonderful studies that go out to the rural services that you've put into place, the costing for the number of students that you're putting out there, is that, do you believe that that's actually covering in the costs of the output that you're getting from the, because I'm sure accommodation, transport, everything else to Broken Hill for large numbers of students is not an easy feat.
We don't cover the students' costs. All our students know that they will do at least 1 out of Sydney placement. They can apply for scholarships. There's a range of scholarships to help offset the costs. They get subsidised accommodation at the University Department of Rural Health. And then the educational staff out there and the support staff are employed on a mix of university and federal government funding.
Thank you.
Another question? I've got one, actually, if I might ask mine. I'm just so interested in this concept of of an emerging placement where there hasn't been one before. So I can see the value to a community of having perhaps an occupational therapy service where there has never been one. Do you see an extension of this? Other disciplines? What else do you think we can do around that issue? How we can expand that?
Look, I think there's great potential for role emerging placements. They're in the allied health professions, not all of them, because some of them obviously require very high-tech equipment and you're not going to trundle those around to settings that don't already have them. But where you're relying on more behavioural or educational interventions, such as we do in speech pathology and occupational therapy, and all of us engage or should engage in health promotion and illness prevention work, those are the kinds of skills that we can take into settings where there is no allied health professional of whatever type. And I think we should be using more of them. People are very nervous. The OTs aren't nervous because they've been doing it for about 20 years. Speech has been doing it in some form or another for about 15 years, so we kind of got our head around it. But some of the disciplines are nervous, and part of that nervousness comes from the constraints of the registration and accreditation requirements that have very rigid supervisory requirements. So if we can get a bit of flex in those, I think there's a lot of opportunity for more role emerging placements, student-led clinics and service learning placements. I think the student-led clinics, role emerging and service learning placements are where we can really develop those generic attributes and skills and the work readiness that we know employers want around teamwork, high-level communication, self-management and so on. They do need to be scaffolded. You can't just throw students out and say, good luck, come back in 6 weeks. You've got to scaffold it carefully and prepare it and have some minimal level of support there. But the admittedly low-level evidence that we have suggests that they're pretty effective and safe.
Thank you, Lindy.
It goes back to high-volume, low-risk clients. You don't do these in high-risk client groups.
Yes, and you wouldn't send out an untrained midwife, for instance, and say, look busy and birth a few babies.
That's right. But you could say to an untrained midwife, go and do some health promotion.
Of course, of course. Have we got some more questions? Good to see the light on us down here. I think that there's one up here. Yes, thank you.
With those placements, you were mentioning some scaffolding would be required. Could you just give some examples of some of the work that's been done with the scaffolding and how that's been set up?
Okay. We know from multiple studies, and later on in this placement, I actually put up some of the things that students tell us they identify as a good quality placement and good supervision, and those studies always show really good orientation. So taking time to orient students to a placement, so they know policies and procedures, they've got a whole range of resources, they know where to find them, they know the resource people to go to, spending time on developing peer learning skills. So how do students communicate with each other in a peer learning environment, and what do they do, and how they maximise that? Some simulation. Broken Hill has some simulation sessions as part of week 1. Some medium to low tech simulation. We don't put them in the resus simulation area at all. Role playing, being really clear about expectations, going through the previous progress notes. What were the goals? What does the site want? So the schools, the principals come in and they tell the students what's been done before, what worked well, what the goals were for the last batch of students and what they want, because it's a community managed project that principals directed, what they want the students to achieve on this next placement block. So all of that good scaffolding and orientation in week 1 I think is really important. Just going to quickly I didn't get time to talk about this, but have a look at the reference if you're interested. This teacher as manager model I think is fabulous and underused. It came out of nursing, but it's now the framework that I use for all of the clinical educator development workshops I run, and my team runs about 20 to 30 a year of these. We use this as the scaffold for those workshops because it helps particularly novice educators get their head around preparation. Getting organised before the students come is worth every cent. and second of time it takes to a smooth delivery, and then making time for the evaluation, not just of the students' outcomes, but also how you went, what needs to change, what resources, what other staff support is needed. I think this is a great scaffold.
One, please, Heather. Thank you.
Just following on again in regard to role emerging placements, is there any evidence in regard to how other supporting people in those who are supporting those students, not of the same discipline, how their reactions, their responses are to supporting those students? Is there any resistance on the part of those people at all?
Well, I'll answer the first part of the question first. No, there's not much evidence, and that's one of the real issues, of course, in all of work integrated learning research, is a lack of strong evidence. Role emerging placements only happen in sites that want the students. Now, but your question is still a really good one, because sometimes managers might want students there, but the people on the ground might not, and the students might be foisted upon them. Now that's problematic. So a good role emerging placement has a lot of investment from the university working with the key staff to get an aligned set of expectations so that everybody knows what the goals are, what the processes for support for the students are.
And that could possibly lead to increased recruitment afterwards, perhaps.
Well, that's one of the major reasons for role emerging placements, and this is why OT loves it. And it's been so successful in occupational therapy, because so often students go into a role emerging placement, the site sees the value of the work they do, and then they recruit and employ an OT of their own.
I think we'll finish there. It's my enormous pleasure to thank Lindy for coming all this way today from Sydney. We know you're going to be here for the rest of the day, and questions will come to us that don't spring into our minds this moment, and you'll be participating in a symposium later on today. Please join me in thanking Lindy McAllister.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.